Good morning and welcome to another edition of Sharpe Takes. I am delighted this morning to have as a guest Dr. Tammy Kolbe, not the least of which because we both graduated from a small Midwestern college called Kalamazoo College and Tammy's gone on to a marvelous career in academia and research, notably researching special education and education finance in general. So thank you for coming,
Thank
Tammy.
you for inviting me, Dave. It's nice to see you again.
It's great to be
Go
here.
Hornets!
Yes, absolutely. So I'd like to start out. You were a key researcher in the development of Act 173, our special education law, and with regard to student weighting.
Mm-hmm.
So how have we done with those? I noticed in your literature that I researched that you say, you know, good laws are only the beginning. They need to be implemented properly and reviewed. How are we doing with these two initiatives?
Well, let's take them in two parts, right?
Yeah.
And so Act 173 fundamentally changed the special education funding formula, and I had the great privilege of working with you on that, and Rebecca Holcomb. I think the implementation of that has been delayed. The funding part has been delayed over a number of years, and we're starting to come into its own now. I think the challenge has been is that that bill sometimes is thought of as a funding formula change, but as you remember, Dave, there were all kinds of systemic changes that were intended to be made and supports, that were supposed to be put in place that really would help districts and schools statewide change special education practice, reorganize how they thought about early intervention and things along those lines. And we changed the funding formula to provide them more flexibility to use those dollars that way. And I think the challenge that I've heard in the field is that implementation on those systemic changes has been slower going and patchy, right? Some places have had more success so far than others. And I think some of that is really due to, systems change is hard, right?
Yeah.
And especially a system around special education for students with disabilities is particularly hard. But, I think we've really, particularly during the pandemic, there just hasn't been enough resources and focus, right, in a lot of places and support to districts. There have been a lot of changes at the agency, over time, and what I hear from districts is that there just needs to be more support for helping to think about how to make those systemic changes.
Yeah, interesting.
Yeah.
And then what about evaluation or looking at it?
I haven't heard of any sort of systematic efforts to evaluate its implementation at this point. But then again, I think we're still pretty, early in the game on that. There were some delays in, implementing that for good reason because, districts needed more time and also then we had COVID. So, these kinds if we want true systems change, that doesn't happen overnight. So I would be hopeful that we might be thinking about evaluating progress on that here in the next couple of years. I think that would be really useful, and I think it could really help, the state think about how do we target resources and target support where it needs to be and what those supports need to be. But I don't think there's any formal evaluation efforts underway right now.
I was, when I was visiting with special educators during the development of that law, and special educators were really excited by the possibility of far less record keeping on the one hand, and then on the other hand, more ability to intervene or help children early on. To avoid labeling, to avoid extra expense in their high school years, where it gets more and more difficult to deal with these issues, doesn't it?
Well, that's true. We know that early intervention is really key, right? And we have such a talented cadre of special education teachers in this state, and what they really want to do is work with students, right? And sometimes policy and laws get in the way of good practice, right? And I think part of what was going on in 173 is trying to take away some of those barriers to good practice, right? In terms of being able to group students and have students who had required special education services, who identified with a disability, and then students who just had learning challenges. But the challenges were similar, and let's put them all in the same group. And Let's not have paperwork requirements take away from instructional time, right? And let's not have a system where, you can't access state dollars until you identify a child for special education. Let's have some flexibility to use those dollars and to align funding with our other state priorities around multi-tiered systems of support and early intervention. Money's a means, not the ends. You've heard me say that before. And, it's really important that we align funding systems with policy goals. In the state, it's really set some policy goals around tiered systems of support and early intervention. And so offering that flexibility made a lot of sense at the time.
So with regard to special ed, I understand you're now looking at national implications of the IDEA Act. Where are you headed there? What's going on?
Yeah, so I've had the great privilege of transitioning from the University of Vermont to the American Institutes for Research about 2 years ago to become the principal investigator for the National Study of Special Education Spending. And we've spent the last 2 years designing the study. It will be the most comprehensive study of what we spend to educate students with disabilities, and then understanding how spending and practice and resources vary across contexts. And so the study will ultimately have about 1,500 school districts and 3,000 schools and 15,000 students nationwide.
Wow, that's big.
Yeah, it is. And I'm very excited about it because I think one of the challenges we have is we really don't understand very well the kind of resources that are required to implement students' IEPs to provide special education services in an effective way. We really don't have a good finger on the pulse of what it costs to do that. And it's really hard to develop fair and efficient funding systems when we don't understand what the resource needs are and what the costs of those resources.
Yeah.
And, we've had this historical promise by the federal government for 40% funding for IDEA. We've never gotten there. In fact, we've, really...
We're in the teens or something
on
like
a good
that
day.
now.
On a good day. Most, sort of, if you look at the trajectory over time, it's more around 10%. And I think if we really want to have a conversation about what the federal funding and then what state roles are, we have 50 different state funding formulas right now. And you could be, hypothetically, the same school district in 2 different states and receive very different amounts of state funding and very different amounts of federal funding. And so that's a really important thing for us to unpack because those local dollars, right? Localities only have so much capacity to raise funding, right? And that variability has implications for not only whether they can identify students, but then the services that they provide students. And that's inherently inequitable. And IDEA was a landmark piece of civil rights legislation, and we need to get it right to make sure that all students, regardless of where they live, have equal educational opportunities.
Yeah, well, thank you for that research. I think it really is important that we are equitable in our delivery of educational resources to kids. And in that regard, another way we talked about it and addressed it in Vermont is this weighting study and trying to weight students appropriately with regard to the appropriate cost to educate those students.
That's right.
It's a huge challenge just to figure out what that weighting is or what that number is. You came up with some recommendations that the legislature didn't entirely adopt, however, moved in that direction. So can you give us a little history on that and where we are now?
Yeah. So, every state includes some sort of cost adjustments. And I think it's important to roll back and think about it in the big picture, like, why do we do that, right? And for an equitable funding system, a state funding system to exist, we have to recognize that there are costs of educating students, either because of student needs or student characteristic, or because of where the school or district are located. They're outside of district control, right? And so it's not entirely fair to a community or a school district that has higher costs for educating students to sort of common standards that are outside of their control, and we don't account for those in the funding formula somewhere. And in school finance parlance, we call that cost factors, right? And so when Act 60 was put in place, the original sort of Act 60 identified a couple cost factors. One was for students who are economically disadvantaged or living in poverty. The second one was for students who are English language learners, right? And then we sort of have always had a special funding formula for students with disabilities, right? In the study that we did, the first thing we did, and we've done this work across the country for umpteen other states, is we said, well, first thing you got to do is figure out, like, what are the cost factors? You know, what are those things that are outside of school district control that result in some districts having higher costs of educating a student to the same standards or sort of meeting state standards than another student? And so the first thing we found in that study is we actually, in the former formula, we're not accounting for all the cost factors that needed to be accounted for. And so poverty is certainly one that popped up that we identified that was was sort of students who are economically disadvantaged. Obviously, students who are English language learners, and students with disabilities. But we also identified the fact that districts operating at different scale, right, that's a cost factor. And we can talk a little bit about that because I think that's a tricky one, right? You know, whether or not you're operating at too small of a scale by choice or by sort of, you know, just sort of de facto because you have to in Vermont because of geography. And also sparsity, right? And so we identified those factors using sort of state-of-the-field school finance research methods. And then what we did is we estimated, okay, for those factors, what is the cost differential, right? And what is unique and important about the kind of work that we've been doing in this area is that what we say is it's the cost of bringing all students up to the same educational standards. So what we're saying is that these are the additional dollars that we can see that need to be spent for all students to meet sort of our objectively common benchmarks for proficiency. It's really important to say that because the Act 60, when we did the weights on Act 60, the field hadn't moved that far, the methods weren't that far. And so those original weights didn't take that into account.
No, they were more or less picked out of the air.
I'll let you say that. That was kind of my understanding, but I want to be generous and fair to the people who wrote the bill. I think that they didn't have the data they needed to do that kind of empirical work. And I think there probably was some political horse trading around those things that happen sometimes. And so when we did the weights, we came in, our models and the weights that we came in with were empirically derived, without all of that kind of thing going on, but also took into account student outcomes and what it costs to get there. And so we came up with a recommended set of weights, and those weights largely were adopted. Now, there are other things that you have to think about when you're changing school funding systems with regard to implementation, and there was a lot of debate in the legislature about what that looked like. And the legislature adopted some of our recommendations, and they came up with some of their own, and that's kind of the way that goes.
Yeah. Great. So, okay, so let's step into the present.
Yep.
Should we be changing the weights? There is at least one legislator who has talked to me about, the weights are a little too heavy for poverty. So are we at a position where we ought to be adjusting those weights? That's a small piece of a bigger picture. The funding system itself is being challenged or criticized for being inadequate or out of date. After all, Act 60 has lasted nearly 4 decades, which far outlasted any previous state funding mechanism.
And nationally, that's an anomaly, right? Like the fact that we really haven't seen fundamental changes to our school finance systems since 1997 is really sort of, if you look nationally, an anomaly.
It's unique.
It's very unique for a couple of reasons, right? Like, and you've been a legislator, you do your best to write good law, but then you take in information and you realize, okay, we need to refine things over time, and also conditions change, right? And the knowledge base changes, and so all of those things have been going on since 1997, and so. I think it certainly was and is high time for the state to sort of take that reflective moment to say, is this the funding system for the next 40 years, right?
So Act 6068 has been tinkered with nearly every year since it was established, and it has run its course. And so the question now, there are 2 plans that I'm aware of that people have put forward. One is the public asset plan that moves to income-based funding of I'm going to call it a modified Act 60 model because I think it retains many of the features of Act 60. the funding mechanism is based more on income than property value. And then another proposal out there is that Scott Beck, new Senator Scott Beck, has put forward of moving to a modified foundation formula where we try to, I think he's trying to modify the foundation in a way that conforms with the Brigham decision, that brings more equity. We know that Act 60 really did bring a dramatic increase in equitable funding for towns with low property value. However, it seems at the moment that the disparity, which still continues some disparity, is more related to the income wealth of a community than it is the property wealth. Yeah. So how do you see these things interacting?
I think, I'm going to go back to my earlier statement, I think we have to think of money as the means, not the ends. And I think we got to think about what are we driving toward here, right? And I think we're driving toward, or I hope we're driving toward, a system that's effective, that's efficient and fair. And we got to think about all three of those things at the same time. What do we know about Act 60? We know about that Act 60 at the time was a landmark piece of legislation, both in the state of Vermont and nationally, for sort of how it thought about a statewide property tax and creating sort of taxpayer equity. And the hope is that by creating taxpayer equity, we would create equitable educational opportunities for all students.
Didn't necessarily follow.
And I think that's an important takeaway, right? And I think that's not just unique to Vermont. I think we have to recognize the limits of funding formula, right, as a policy lever for improving student opportunity and outcomes, right? It needs to be having money matters. Let's be clear, right? Money matters, and how we spend those dollars matters. However, that's one of the pieces of the puzzle. You got to have a really well-functioning, high-quality educational system as a whole, right? And funding needs to be part of that. And so I think sort of having all these years now to sort of look back on Act 60, we can say, yeah, I think that was a big step forward. But I think we also can recognize now, or at least in my opinion, what I see is that we've had a system that's run its course. Right, and we need to think about the intersections between revenue and spending. Right now, we have a spending challenge, right? And part of that spending challenge is not necessarily that districts are running around just trying to spend, willy-nilly, right? That's not what's going on, right? We have an incredibly talented group of school boards in this state and superintendents who are working really hard to do good work. So this is not an issue of overspending, right? But what we have real challenges in our system around what we have to purchase, right? And we need to think about, as I know you've thought a lot about, Dave, is, what does it mean to operate at scale, And, we've done some work around that, right? We're consolidating special education to the SUs. We have the new work, the new legislation that is prompting us to think about BOCES, or sort of more regionalization. But we still got a lot of small schools, and we got a lot of small districts out there. We don't have a statewide teachers contract, right? And we, by a matter of principle, we don't have a statewide curriculum, but, we also have an agency that has really struggled, right, to provide the kind of support to the field that would help sort of unify and provide a more uniform set of, curricular options and supports to teachers. So I don't know that just fixing the funding formula is going to get there. But Senator Beck and I have talked a lot about foundation formula. I've talked about that with other folks, and I think I've testified in the legislature before. More than 30 states in this country use foundation formula. And by the way, they all have constitutional provisions that look relatively similar to Vermont. We're not that different. And my expert opinion is that a foundation formula does not run counter to the Brigham decision. But what a foundation formula does is it says, here's what we think everybody should be spending. And the state, right, there are different ways to think about funding that. And I think that's what public assets institutes, they're thinking about, well, how do we fund that? What a foundation formula starts with says, here's what we think, based on good empirical research, an adequate spending level should be. And then there are cost adjustments to that, just like weights, right, that you put on top of that.
Yeah.
And what that does is that sort of puts a marker on the table and says, this is where we think we should be. And then what we need to do is help school districts and also design a system in terms of scale and scope that fits within that. That number, though, is not a minimum education, right? That's supposed to pay for sort of a 21st century education. Like, we're not trying to minimize, right? But what we're trying to do is make sure that our spending and how we allocate dollars are aligned with our policy goals for being effective and efficient and fair, right? Yeah. And that it promotes that. Right now, we have a complete disconnect between spending and revenues.
Yeah.
And that's really hard.
So it's hard for me to reconcile the current notion of going to a foundation formula with past notions of a foundation formula and the way that they failed in the past. First, they were inadequate to begin with, and then secondly, there was no mechanism for increasing the the foundation. So inflation eventually made them irrelevant.
That's right.
And then the state was in crisis, and it only took 8 to 10 years before it happened.
Right.
And so then you'd rework the whole thing all over again.
A well-functioning foundation formula needs to have, first of all, the foundation amount needs to be empirically derived, right? This cannot be a dartboard exercise or a political exercise, right? We need to have a real, fulsome conversation in the state about what we think a 21st century education needs to be, and what it takes to what's going to cost to do that, and what's going to cost to do that for all children, regardless of their needs, and in all places. Right? They're going to have to be cost adjustments to that. That's the first thing we have to do. And that number is really important. But then we have to attend to that number, right? That's not a one and done number. In most states, we do cost studies every 3 to 4 years to make sure that number is staying on track. But money matters. And I think the other thing that I'm concerned and don't want to get lost in this conversation is sort of this race to the bottom to constrain spending in a way that we undermine what is really, I think we also have to recognize Vermont has an excellent, excellent education system. We want to maintain that, right?
Actually, we want to improve it.
That's right.
Certainly not downgrade it.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. And so when I talk to folks about this, and that's why I start with money matters. Like, we don't want to be, name your state that spends $9,000 a year per student, where students have no opportunity to have 21st century science or language or arts or music, right? We as Vermonters feel strongly that is really important for our students. And Vermonters have, over time, demonstrated over and over and over again a commitment to paying for that. What we just need to do is we got to true these two things up to make sure that we're really clear about what is necessary, and then make the changes to the systemic organization, right? How we organize the system and make sure that it's operating efficiently so that we're getting all we can out of those dollars that we're spending.
Excellent. So one of the things that disturbed me in the news about education funding and finance was the weighting study, and I was delighted that these new weights were put in place, because I think the old ones were not empirically derived or adequate in any way. That some districts took that expanded tax capacity, if you will, and said, "Oh, wonderful, we can cut taxes," and additional the need that the children had for additional work that required paying for went by the wayside.
I think that was a missed opportunity in 127, and that was something we talked about in our report. That one of our suggestions was when we make these changes to the weights, that there's also a requirement that you can't spend less, right? You can't, if we're providing the additional tax capacity to a community, the intent is for you to use that tax capacity to bring spending up, right? But one of the challenges we have in this state is local control. Yeah. And that's a long-standing value that we've held. And Act 60 reflects that, right? Like, we allow all of our school districts to come up with their budgets. We pile them all together and then we fund them. But when District X decides to put in an indoor track over here, everybody pays for it, right? And when this district decides to underspend, there's no mechanism, right?
Yeah.
And so if we really, really care about equity, we have to attend to that issue. And, Act 60, I think the principles was great, because all children should be our children, not my children, not your children. But the system has created different incentives around that. And I think it would be great for us to think about how to reform the system in a way so we make all children our children, and so that we create opportunities for all kids that are equitable.
So my notion might be, or let me put this idea out there, that the foundation amount, you arrive empirically, so to speak, at the starting point.
Yep.
And then it is automatically adjusted by the average educational spending across the state on an annual basis. So there's a function in there that doesn't allow it to become antiquated in a decade.
Yeah. I haven't seen it done that way. That's an interesting construct. I'd want to think about that more. Most states tie it to some sort of inflationary adjustment, right? Either the CPI, we have the SWIFT, there are other kinds of inflationary adjustments that automatically adjust that. Other states put in requirements, and they're into statute, that there's a cost study or a cost study done every few years to sort of make sure that you're recalibrating, because we also know that the technology and sort of what we know about education changes over time. But all of that presumes, right, that local school boards and local school districts know how to spend dollars wisely. And I think in Vermont, we have school boards and school districts who are working really hard to do that. But, your local school board officer has a day job. They may not be reading all the educational research every day, right? And our superintendents and our principals, they're well educated, they're doing their best, but they would really welcome support on that too. So I think if we're serious about addressing these challenges, we also need to scaffold support and resources for our school boards and our school districts to help them think about what is highly effective practice and look like, and programs look like for school districts, and recognize that those things are going to change over time. And how do we budget for those things? And what kinds of adjustments do we need to make within school districts to make sure that we're always using our resources really effectively? Right?
Okay, so we only have a couple minutes left. There's a lot more I wanted to cover. Maybe I'll have to get you back.
Happy to.
So school boards. So we have a state school board that you're on. Is this something that the state school board should be doing? Should they be doing this analysis? What is the role currently, and what should be the role of the State Board of Education?
Oh, boy. Well, the role currently is that the State Board of Education, under changes to statute, has no real role in policy for the state. We are really a rulemaking body, and so as a rulemaking body, what we do is we write the rules to implement key elements of statute. So one of the things I'm particularly proud of that the State Board has done in the last 2 years is we updated the education quality standards for Act 1. And Act 1 is this really important landmark piece of legislation, as you know, in the state that really was a call to action to prioritize equity, right? And so we were able to update the educational quality standards with help from the Act 1 working group and input from a broad range of constituents in the field to develop a really strong rule, probably one of the most progressive rules in the country around anti-discrimination for students and what an equitable education looks like. So the State Board is engaged in that kind of work. We were able to extend much of what we had in the EQS to the rules for independent schools as well. And the real goal there with the rules is to, of course, provide equitable educational opportunities for everyone. So, the State Board's role is really right now around rulemaking, and, that's sort of the statutory construction. Those have been changes over time. It was the case at one point that the Agency of Education reported, as you know, to the State Board. The Agency of Education no longer reports to the State Board.
And you don't pick the secretary, we
do a preliminary scan, right?
Yeah.
And we can make recommendations to the governor, and then that is a privilege of the governor's office.
Right. Yeah. Which is a change from past practice.
Yeah.
So
but all of those were statutory changes that happened that predate my time on the board.
Yes, I realize. So I just want to thank you so much for coming.
This is
and
great.
we
Thanks,
do
Dan.
have a lot more territory to cover,
do.
so maybe I will ask you to come back
I'd
and
love to
cover
come
some
back.
more.
This would be terrific. Thanks for the opportunity, and thanks again for all your service and work to the state in this area. It's
And
really important.
likewise to you. If we don't have somebody that's taking a independent, honest look at what we're trying to accomplish, we'll never get to where we want to go.
Well, I think all Vermonters care deeply about our education system. I think that's a unifying theme, and I think we may have some challenges right now, but I hope that we can all keep our eye on the most important ball, and that is how do we best serve our students?
Our children,
That's
absolutely.
Right. That's right.
So thank you.
Thank you.
And thanks for listening. It's been another edition of Sharpe Takes, where we try to understand what's happening in public education.